Hi everybody, and welcome to Virtual Sunday School. Now, if you remember last week, we talked about betrayal. Betrayal? Who is going to betray Jesus? I mean, for the last 3 years, Jesus has been followed by his disciples. I mean, last week we called them knights. They were protecting Jesus. Who would want to betray Jesus? And if Jesus is truly God, wouldn't he know that he is going to be betrayed? So our story of the betrayal begins not after the Last Supper, but it begins during the Last Supper. It's almost like a spy movie, because during the Last Supper, Judas, now that's Judas Iscariot, is already thinking that maybe Jesus is not quite the king that he says he is. Satan put the thought into Judas's mind. Satan played on Judas Iscariot's doubt, but also he knew that Judas was a thief. He was no better than the money changers that we talked about earlier. And so now Judas has a reason. He sees money as more important than who Jesus was. And so what does Judas do? He goes and he finds the leaders of the Pharisees who already wanted to condemn Jesus. And he goes to them and he says, I've got information on Jesus. What will you pay me? And the Pharisees said, we'll pay you 30 pieces of silver. And Judas Iscariot says, done. I'll betray Jesus for this money. So now the Pharisees say, how are we going to capture Jesus? Judas Iscariot, what's your plan? And Judas says, I know where he'll be. And so we're going to set up a sting operation. Remember, I said this was kind of like a spy movie. And so what Judas tells the Pharisees is that you follow behind, not too close, and then I'm going to meet the disciples. And the person that I kiss on the cheek, that's going to be Jesus. And that's the person that you're going to arrest. Remember, the Pharisees didn't have pictures of Jesus. It wasn't like they had an FBI dossier file on him or anything like that. I mean, what kind of description could they give about Jesus? A long-haired guy with a beard? I mean, that's like saying, the Greek who owns the restaurant. I mean, that could be 100,000 people. So they needed some way to be able to be sure that they were arresting the right person. And so now Judas in the garden passes by each one of the disciples until he gets to Jesus. And just before Judas gives Jesus a kiss, Jesus lets Judas know and says to him quietly, do what you must do. Can you imagine what Judas was thinking at that moment, that he knows that Jesus knows he's the betrayer? And what does Judas do? He gives him the kiss on the cheek, and the Pharisees and the soldiers come in and they arrest him. But Jesus knew all along what was going to happen to him. But now this wasn't the only betrayal. When the soldiers approached Jesus to arrest him, what do you think that his disciples did? Well, we just called them knights, so what would you expect? That all of them would draw their swords and they would fight and they would protect Jesus. But that's not what happened. They ran away. The disciples ran away, except Peter, because Peter drew his sword and he reached out to one of the soldiers and he cut his ear off. And so now Peter's already attacked one of the soldiers. And what do you think that Jesus does? Does Jesus now whip up a tornado or an earthquake and swallow up all the soldiers? I mean, he is God. He could have done that, but that's not what he does. He takes Peter by the arm and he lowers his arm and he says, no, Peter, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And so now God has been arrested. So what does Peter do? Peter now embarks on his own covert spy mission. He follows the soldiers and Jesus to the high priest's house where they were holding the trial of Jesus in the middle of the night. And so Peter goes over next to the window and he's warming himself by the fire. But Peter doesn't belong. I mean, he's this smelly fisherman coming from the area of Galilee. I mean, it's kind of like being a Scotsman in a Greek restaurant. I mean, everybody's going to know him by his accent. So one of the servant girls there next to the fire, she says, "Aren't you one of those people that were following Jesus?" And Peter's in this covert mission. He says, No, it's not me. It's not me." Two more people then also say, "You know what? You sound a lot like those Galileans. I think you were following him." And twice more, Peter says, No, it's not me." And then all of a sudden, Peter hears what? His arch nemesis, the rooster. And why would the rock be so afraid of a rooster? I mean, come on. It was because he remembered the words of Jesus to him, to Peter, that said, "Before the rooster crows 3 times, you will deny me." And the minute that Peter remembered that, he began to break down and he cried because he knew that he had betrayed Jesus. And so why is this considered a betrayal? I mean, it was Peter the rock who was the only one doing anything. I mean, he's the one that cut the ear off trying to protect Jesus, and he was the one who covertly went in to find Jesus at the trial. It was because Peter remembered what Jesus said, and he remembered what he said back to Jesus. Jesus said, "You will deny me, Peter, 3 times before the rooster crows." And St. Peter said to Jesus, "I will never betray you. I will always stand up for you." So that's why it was a betrayal. He lied to Jesus. So now, what's the difference then between these two betrayals? Judas Iscariot selling Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, and St. Peter now denying Jesus 3 times. Both of them were sad, and both of them felt very bad about what they did. But Judas went off and he killed himself. What Peter did was, feeling repentant, he went back to Jesus and he said, "Oh my Lord, I repent for what I've done. Is there any way that I can be forgiven for what I did?" He went back and he asked for forgiveness from Jesus, which Jesus granted to him. And this now is the difference for us to learn, is that yes, we all make mistakes. We all make mistakes. But when we make that mistake, then we own up to that mistake and we go back to that person and we try to correct it. That's the lesson that we learned from Peter. And look what happened to Peter. Peter became the patron saint of the Catholic Church. He became the rock on which that church was established. Now, what happened at the trial? And what happened after the trial? What's going to happen to Jesus? Well, you're going to have to wait until next week to hear the rest of the story.